Greetings, everyone. This is a study that I have made after some requests about how people would like to have an easy go-to guide to explain what justification by faith is to their Church of Christ friends and neighbors. Um, I hope this is helpful to you. Join us on this journey as we walk through what faith is and what justification is as based off in the New Testament. First off here we have going to do a quick introduction into where the idea of justification by faith is explained, and to that we go to the book of Romans. Now, a tip for when you're dealing with your Church of Christ friends and neighbors, they're going to object to you going to the book of Romans. They're going to say that you can't read someone's mail to establish New Testament doctrine. So we're going to work from that perspective and show you how to answer that argument while also addressing the teachings of the text. To do so, we're going to do a brief recap of the purpose of the book of Romans. Romans is about the only book in the New Testament that comes anywhere close to presenting a systematic theology of Christianity. It was written to establish an established church, but as of yet had no apostolic founding. Check out chapter 15 and verse 20, where Paul said, "And thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation." Now, the church in Rome needed strengthening from an apostle, as they have yet not to have received it at that time, as chapter 1, verses 11 through 12 tells us. Paul says that he had longed to see them, that he may impart to them some spiritual gift to strengthen you, that is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. In order to do this, he had to ground them firmly in the gospel and how one lives in light of accepting the good news. Chapter 1 and verse 3, to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations. In chapters 1 through chapters 3 verse 20, Paul lays out mankind's problem and why people need to obey by believing. And in chapter 3, verses 21 through 22, he provides the solution. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. Check that out. The gospel is not new. It's within the Old Testament. It bears witness to it, to the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Chapter 3, 27 to 28 states that this justification occurs by the law of faith. Pay special attention. The law of faith, and not by the law of works, as he refers to in this verse. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Romans 3:31 clarifies this issue of law even further when we bring up the discussion of what the law of works is and the law of faith. He then says, do we then overthrow the law, that is the Torah, by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. This word uphold is the standard word that's used elsewhere in the New Testament of standing up something. So the law has a function in the life of the believer. So you have the law of faith, that is the commandment that we are to believe in Jesus Christ, and that commandment forces us and allows us, through the power of the Spirit, to keep the law. Now, Paul was not promoting another justification by another system of law. It's very important to remember this, because he says when faith comes, the law of Moses has not been overthrown. You can see the Greek word here, katargumen, nullified or invalidated, but instead the law is upheld, as we've said earlier. Istonomen, from histemi. It means to uphold, maintain, or validate. Check out Mark 7 and 9 on that, and with the Pharisees upholding traditions, how they put away the commandment of God and instead, in its place, went to establish tradition. So we have the law of faith and the law of works. The law of faith saves, the law of works will not save, but yet the law of works proceeds from the power that comes from the law of faith in the work of the Spirit. So to prove his point, he goes to Exhibit A to show what it means to be justified by faith in Romans chapter 4. In verse 1 of that chapter, he asked the question, what did Abraham find out concerning this issue? In verse 2, he asked the question, if he was justified by works or what he did, he would have something to boast about, but not towards God. Verse 3 provides the proof for this conclusion by citing, this is very important, Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now verse 4 clarifies that if one has to work to obtain something, his wages are not credited as a gift, but as what one is owed. And in verse 5, it asserts the principle, either you are working or you are believing. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. And here you have the Greek, to me egozomino pistuanti de epi ton dikaunta ton asabe. Here you have present participles. You're either continuously working or you're somebody who's continuously believing. There are no third options. It's the one or the other. Verse 10 asked an important question. How did Abraham's justification occur? Paul bases his conclusions in a temporal argument, in that he makes his point based upon when statements occurred in the Old Testament. Abraham was justified before his circumcision. He was justified at Genesis 15:6, not a moment before or a moment afterward. Abraham was circumcised as an act that proceeded from his faith in Yahweh, but this played no role whatsoever in his justification. In fact, in verse 11, he appeals to the narrative in Genesis 17:11 that states that circumcision was a seal, a semeion, of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Romans 4:11. So righteousness was something that he possessed before he obeyed the command of circumcision. And circumcision did not add to that righteousness. So what kind of faith was Abraham justified by? Was it merely a mental assent or the mere acknowledgement of facts as facts? In verse 18, he says that in hope he believed against hope, when he literally had no way he could affect the promise of God himself. He was able to look out at the stars and place all of his hope and trust in someone other than himself. So it wasn't mental assent to facts or acknowledging facts as facts. He was entrusting his life over for the first time to the providential care of Yahweh himself. As it goes on to state in verse 21, Abraham was fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. As Yahweh promised him, so shall your seed be. He believed against all hope, and he was fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. It moved beyond accepting facts as facts. It moved beyond mental assent. It was trust. He entrusted his whole life and destiny by resting in the hands of a faithful Creator. He trusted in Yahweh alone for his righteousness, for his salvation, for his deliverance. But then the question will come up as you talk to your Church of Christ friends and neighbors, but wasn't Abraham saved before Genesis 15? Let's examine that question. Does Hebrews 11:8 give us warrant to claim that Abraham was already saved before Genesis 15:6? After all, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. But do you remember Joshua's commentary on this issue in Joshua 24:2-3, where he said, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river. So Abraham was just as much an idolater as the rest of his family until God made a decisive move. So when did Abraham truly trust God? When did he actually obey God, as Hebrews 11 indicates? Consider God's original commandment given to him in Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord had said, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. But is that what Abraham did? I want you to go back to Genesis 11:31 and watch what Moses says here. Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Who made the initial move? Terah did. Did they go to Canaan at first? No, they did not. Terah stopped at Haran, and there they stayed till Terah died, and only then did Abraham begin to move on. Did Abraham truly obey the Lord at this point? Consider Genesis 12:4-5. So Abraham went on as the Lord had told him, and who accompanied Abram? And Lot went with him. His father's house is still with him on the way to the road to Canaan. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Now Abraham did a lot of religious things, and in some of those religious activities God gave him promises, like Genesis 12:6-8. But just a few verses later, at the very side of famine, when he was in the land of Canaan, he refused to stay, and he went off straight to Egypt, where he thought things would be safe for him. So in chapters 13, after all this episode, him carrying around his father's family with him, him carrying around his nephew Lot, nothing but trouble all the time. And when that family turmoil finally reached its breaking point, he chose the worst of the land of Canaan in order to keep the peace between the family he was told to leave behind. This brings both Abraham and Lot into the drama of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 14:1-16. One good note is the blessing of Melchizedek, who was the type of Christ, verses 17-20. But then finally, after a series of failure and incomplete obedience and incomplete faith, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. In Genesis 15, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, O Yahweh God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, This man will not be your heir. Your very own son will be your heir. And he took him outside, and he said, Look toward heaven, and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And this is where we reach the critical point in Abraham's life. And he believed Yahweh, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It was after this episode where Abraham was brought to saving faith, just like the believer is now, the Lord confirmed his faith. He asked the Lord, O Yahweh God, how am I to know that I will possess it? Because this was the custom. God would impart a sign of confirmation to the one who had trusted in him. And in verse 17 it indicates he had a strange dream of the sun going down, and it turned dark, and a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between two pieces of an animal that had been offered, stripped into two. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, To your offspring I will give this land. And then he lists all these people, their lands will be his. And by that he was saying, if I do not keep my word to you, then let Yahweh God be torn in half. That's how seriously God treated this moment. But then the next question comes up. Now that we have exegeted Romans 4 and put that back into Genesis 12 and other places, we have to answer the question, how does that fit with James 2? Does James 2 contradict the teachings of Paul? Now, James 2:24 is often presented as either a challenge to the Protestant interpretation of justification or proof of the allegation that there are multiple methods of salvation presented in the New Testament. The verse goes, You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith only. And you can see the Greek here, ex ergon dikautai, and uk ek pisteos monon. These phrases will become very important later. From works is justified, not from faith only. The question is, what kind of faith saves? Now, people often fail in this discussion to remember that James is talking to the visible church. What's also missing in this discussion oftentimes is the first two questions posed by James in chapter 2 and verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith? There's the word here, piston. You first see it here without the article. That's what it means here by anarthros. It refers to the abstract principle of faith. But he doesn't have works. What good is that? What's the benefit? Me dunatai he pistis sozai auton. Here you have the article now before pistis. It's asking the question, that kind of faith, it points back up to the faith of the previous verse. That kind of faith won't save him, will it? And with the particle here, may, the answer is assumed no. So we're asking the question, the kind of faith that saves. That faith isn't able to save sodzai him, is it? The answer is no. Verse 17, the faith that saves is a faith that is alive, that produces works as a result. The question then becomes, how does one prove he has faith? Verse 18 marks a dramatic shift in the discussion and also contains a debate over how you actually translate this verse. The best solution to the translation dilemma in verse 18 is to phrase it this way. But someone will say, do you have faith? The answer back from James is, oh, but I have works. It is a challenge back to James that this interlocutor here is throwing back at James in order to justify himself. So it's no longer a question over the faith that saves. It's now James answering an accusation that's been leveled at him, and also an accusation that'll be leveled at every believer. The verse concludes with James' response, you show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And verse 19 asserts that his accuser's faith is no different and of the same kind that the demons themselves possess. And that's how serious this is. The kind of faith that saves. A faith that has no works ultimately does no good. We return back to the first question of verse 14 and verse 16. What is the benefit toward yourself or your fellow man to have a demonic faith? Verse 20 asserts that this faith means one is both empty and he's barren. There is nothing of real saving faith in his heart. But still we're left with the question, how can a believer still be justified by works? How can this still be said to be true? James is offering proof that faith without works is useless once more. In verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified, here's the Greek word here, idikaothe, by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? Now this would be a clear contradiction of Paul if he was referring to be justified by a system of faith and not by faith itself. If it meant justification by that said system, we would have to follow Abraham's system to be saved. Check out Romans 4 and verse 12. But who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. If we're justified by a system, the faith, as it is often alleged, then it would have to be the exact system of Abraham that he used at his time, and which he was saved by, that we would have to be saved by. Now, we need to take a closer look at the term justified. Was the term justified, idikaothe, is this the same justification spoken of by Paul? No. For one, each author addresses different audiences. And two, if they were speaking of the same subject, they would be at odds with each other, as Paul speaks of justification as a once-for-all-time event, and James alludes to a future event subsequent to faith itself. We have to consider the semantic domain of dikao here to provide clarification. Dikao can mean vindication, proven, or demonstrated to be in the right. This demonstration here benefited Abraham, Isaac, their household, and even us to this very day. Now, our faith completed by works. What does this term mean? In verse 22, you see that faith, hey pistis again, the anaphoric article pointing us back, was active along soon erge with his works, and faith was ateliothei by his works, completed by his works. Now this raises a few questions. If faith is deficient in the sight of God unless and until works are added to it, how many works does one have to do until justification is achieved? Can one know when they have arrived at justification? Did Abraham ever really know? Is an individual justified multiple times in life? Why is there a need for multiple justifications if multiple justifications are the case? The problem again is solved by the semantic domain of teleao, brought to its end or accomplishing its goal. Abraham's faith was meant it was purposed, its goal was to bless both himself, his son, and the whole. And in verse 23, we come to another important phrase that we have to make sure we have a good understanding on. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. We're going to zero in on this term, was fulfilled. Now, James now cites Genesis 15:6 and Isaiah 41:8 to prove his point. And the assertion is made that this means that Genesis 15:6 was a prophecy and not a statement of fact issued by Moses concerning Abraham. And again, this puts Paul at odds with James, referring to an event after circumcision and Genesis 15:6. Once again, semantic domain solves the problem. If we interpret the idea of being fulfilled, means brought to its designed end, we're not just left with imputed righteousness, we see a result of life transformation that blesses everyone else in the process, in the present and in the future. All of these so-called contradictions go. James concludes his argument in verse 24. You see, a person is justified dikaioutai by works and not by faith alone. Taking everything we've learned and coming to this controversial verse, what does it mean? The interpretation shown to be in the right for dikaioutai solves all difficulties. It's a gnomic present context text here, meaning that it's not a continuous action as the previous verse shows, since it is in the past tense and also in the passive voice. This justification occurs throughout time, throughout many believers' lives. The example of Rahab is brought up in the same way. In the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Her faith was different than the others of Jericho. Check out Numbers 2 and 11 for that difference. They shut up their city, but Rahab was willing to help and save. So, more conclusions from James in verse 26. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Works are such an essential point of the Christian life that you cannot have one without the other. If the interpretation of those who promote a system of justification is true, your works would have to make your faith alive. Therefore, a dead faith produces works that then make faith living. It's a walking contradiction, and we cannot accept this. So, summarizing our study together, guys. Paul spoke of justification before God by the means of faith alone. And this has been borne witness to long before Jesus ever appeared. Both Paul and James confirm that faith is more than mental assent. It involves one entrusting their very soul and destiny to a faithful Creator. James discusses both the faith that saves and the faith that profits. And any interpretation of James that sets him at odds with Paul has to be rejected. And finally, both of these authors, Paul and James, affirm the necessity of living a holy life, not in order to be saved, but as a result of being saved. I hope you find this study helpful, and this will help your friends and neighbors who are of the Church of Christ perspective. If you have questions or comments, you can always reach out to me at any time at paul1t2day@gmail.com. I'll be happy to assist you in any way. God bless each and every one of you.